Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 124, The Other Thunderbolt. John Massey Thompson was born in London on the 17th of December 1847. He was one of 16 children born to William Thompson, a clerk, and his wife, Elizabeth Massey, the daughter of an Irish clergyman, Andrew Craig Massey. John Thompson was the son of educated middle-class urban folk, a respectable family. The family arrived in Sydney on the 10th of September 1852 from Bristol, England, on the Scurry. His father was an employee of the City of Sydney Corporation, an administrator who bore the illustrious title of Assistant Inspector of Nuisances, a promotion of sorts from his previous role as Inspector of Water Closets. No doubt his duties were of pen-pushing variety, and he employed others to undertake the less salubrious tasks of actually inspecting the water closets, or the nuisances. John Thompson was a difficult child. In 1859, John was apprenticed to John Brown, master of the brig Venus. There was a case that was based on his 11-year-old apprentice, John Thompson, prosecuting his boss. And a reporter stated that he listened to Thompson's testimony and he said he's a sharp but pert boy. The lad reported that Brown had caught him by the ear and pulled him off the gangway, and that when he resisted and broke away, Brown grabbed his hair and drove him ashore. Thompson immediately stalked across to the police office and laid charges against his master. When questioned, he said, "I will not be ill-used by anybody, not even the governor." And his boss said, "What sort of language is that?" "It is English grammar," came the impertinent reply, at which Brown grabbed a double-upped rope and beat the boy, while a chained dog lunged at him and bit him. And John Brown stated that he had been authorised by John Thompson's father to chastise the boy when he deserves it. At the age of 16, in 1864, his father sent him hundreds of miles away to the tough environment of Terry High Station near Moree. He was employed by Mr. Bowman's superintendent, Mr. Sullivan, until around January 1865, when he threatened to shoot the superintendent, and he left taking a horse with him, having frequently expressed a wish to join the bushrangers, which he did within a month, as in February 1865 it was deduced from later cases that he joined Thunderbolt's gang, and the gang consisted at the time of Mary Ann Bugg, Thomas Hogan, known as the Bull, and a lad called Macintosh. That gang had been operating since January around the regions of Culgoa and Bocara rivers. On the 16th of March 1865, Thunderbolt and his three gang members barred up Mogul Station north of Collarenebri and stole £7. On the 17th of March 1865, Thunderbolt and his gang robbed Arnold Esquire of Rocky Creek between the Narran and Barwon rivers. On the 20th of March 1865, Thunderbolt and his gang entered and searched William Earl's Squatters' Arms pub at Collarenebri, and also bailed up Peter Gather, returning from the Collarenebri races around the same time. On the 21st of March 1865, Thunderbolt and the gang robbed a dray of William Lawson, a dealer at Mogul, and stole 12 brown shirts, 13 pairs of trousers, 10 being moleskins, 24 pairs of spurs, 4 bridles, 4 pairs of hobbles, 24 pocket knives, 2 loaded whips, 5 revolvers, belts and pouches, and then headed west towards the Narran River. On the 26th of March 1865, Thunderbolt and gang bailed up the station of Alexander Macleay, James Little and William Beaumont at Tullawanta on the Beery River, about 100 miles northeast from Burke, and stole 4 saddles, 6 saddle straps, 1 bridle, 1 pair of saddlebags, 2 double-barrelled guns, 5 boxes of percussion caps, 3 red blankets, 5 pairs of trousers, 2 pairs of Wellington boots, 2 tweed coats, 3 water cans and a bay mare. The next day, the message reached the police station at Burke. 2 days later, the police, accompanied by Mr. Beaumont, followed Thunderbolt's gang to Narran Lake. On the 1st of April, they found Thunderbolt's camp near the lake, inhabited by Mary Ann Bugg, 2 children and stolen goods. On the 2nd of April, Mary Ann Bugg was arrested for having stolen property in her possession, but on the journey back to Burke, she feigned labour and was dropped off at George Forrester's Wilby Station on the Narran River. 2 days later, Thunderbolt's gang bailed up Wilby Station, rescued Mary Ann and her children, returning twice more during the same night, the first time to rob the inhabitants and the 2 hawkers who were spending the night, stealing around £10 from the residents and about £20 in cash and goods. The second visit was for an unknown reason. Between the 5th and the 18th of April 1865, Thunderbolt and his gang headed towards the Tamworth district, taking pregnant Mary Ann and the children with them. Thunderbolt employed a part Aboriginal woman to assist Mary Ann during her confinement, or in other words, the delivery of the baby, before he and his gang headed northwest again. On the 19th of April 1865, Thunderbolt, McIntosh and Thompson robbed the Warelda Tamworth mailman, who was Martin Hurley, about 4 miles from Manila, taking the mailman's horse for their mate, presumably the bull, who was reportedly in the bush with an exhausted horse. They also bailed up a buggy driven by Mr. Ross of Mile Creek. On the 19th and 20th of April 1865, Thunderbolt's gang rode towards Baraba and that night stole 2 of the best horses from Lloyd's Station near Manila. That same night they went to Baraba and stole 2 of Mr. Sinclair's horses, leaving the Warelda mailman's horse and 1 stolen from Lloyd's. On the 24th of April 1865, Thunderbolt's gang robbed Hugh Munro's Boggy Creek Inn, which was 30 miles northwest of Narrabri, of around £50 in goods, and then headed north, sticking up the traveller Mr. Baldwin, before arriving at William Walford's Sportsman's Arms at Millie. The police arrived at the inn, and then there was an ensuing shootout, with Thompson wounded and arrested while the remaining gang members escaped. Thompson received wounds in the left side of his jaw and neck, right side of his torso, rump and legs. The other bushrangers escaped unharmed. The day after, John Thompson was reported to be lying in a serious condition at Millie Inn, and on the 28th and 29th of April, telegrams were sent from Tamworth and Sydney, incorrectly reporting that Thompson was dead. Across April and May in 1865, Thompson was committed for trial by the Wee Waa bench on 2 charges of robbery under arms and was initially allowed to bail as police made no objection, but it was revoked 2 hours later by a magistrate. Questions about the bail officer were raised in Parliament and the magistrate was ultimately rebuked but not fired. On the 6th of May 1865, it says Constables Dalton, Lynch and Norris started last Thursday in pursuit of 4 bushrangers. After riding 250 miles, they came into contact with them about 30 miles from Wee Waa. About 40 shots were exchanged. Constable Dalton shot the bushranger John Thompson. The others escaped, but the police are in pursuit of them. The gang is supposed to be that known as Captain Thunderbolts, and much credit is due to the superintendent of the constabulary here. At Urella, north of Albury, 2 bushrangers were overtaken and captured after a pursuit that lasted 5 days. On the 24th of April 1865, Constable Dalton, volunteers and other police parties, including a Queensland force, followed Thunderbolt's remaining gang members but stopped when the rain obliterated their tracks. Their search resumed on the 5th of May, and by mid-May the gang was reported to be somewhere around Kookaran Lake between the Narran and Barwon rivers. They were still on the run by early June, and the Riverina Herald complained that the Warrego district was being besieged by criminal refugees from New South Wales, including Thunderbolt, while other reports mention that Thunderbolt stole horses and rations from Rutherford's Warrego station and also stuck up Mr. Furlong's station near Thurl-Goonab, near the Queensland border. And it seems that around this time, McIntosh disappears and the gang seemingly splits up. In the meantime, Thompson was conveyed to Gunnedah and then to Tamworth, where he was lodged in jail. On the 10th of June, Thompson escaped from Tamworth jail after picking open the ring of his hobbles and climbing over the 8-foot jail wall. He hadn't been able to discard the hobbles altogether, however, and his lurching pace slowed him enough to be caught. And the Tamworth press said he is as impudent and boastful as formerly, indicating that Thompson's brush with death hadn't chastened him. However, he was clever enough to know when he was beaten. 2 months after the shooting, he pleaded guilty and he was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of 15 years on the roads. He saw the insides of many New South Wales jails, including Maitland Jail, Darlinghurst Jail, Cockatoo Island and Parramatta Jail. Whilst in Parramatta Jail on the 1st of August 1870, he was found with a skeleton key and hook in his possession, and he was incarcerated in dark cells on bread and water for 28 days for that misdemeanour. He also spent time in Berrima Jail, and in there on the 12th of October, he was incarcerated in dark cells for 3 days for communicating with fellow prisoners contrary to regulations. By the time he got to the 24th of April 1871, he was readmitted to Parramatta Jail from Berrima Jail, and his sentence was commuted to 7 years. His mother had petitioned the visiting Prince Alfred on the grounds of her son's extreme youth at the time of the crimes, claiming that Thunderbolt's wiles had drawn the boy into a life of crime. However, she died before his eventual release. On the 3rd of February 1872, the Attorney-General James Martin authorises his release from jail on the 25th of June, and on the 26th of June he was discharged from Parramatta Jail. Once released, his tally of crimes and aliases continued to increase. A year later, James Jameson, alias Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, again fired at the police after attempting to rob the Australian Mutual Providence Society. And at this time there was a description in the Government Gazette stating that he was Protestant, a carpenter labourer, he can read and write, 5'6", slight build, fair complexion, light hair, no beard, bluish-grey eyes, a mole on the right arm, second finger on right, disjointed in the middle, 2 small moles on the right jaw, mole on the left side of neck, and one witness claimed Thompson was stupid-looking. On the 24th of December 1872, it was reported in the Maitland Mercury that Thunderbolt's boy, Thompson, was arrested today as an accomplice in a burglary near Moore Park. He is believed to be the person who fired twice at police. And also in the Sydney Morning Herald, John Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, was charged with having, on the night of the 11th and the morning of the 12th, burglarously entered the house of William Gillespie and stole 2 coats, 2 table covers and other articles valued at £15. Senior Constable Larkins deposed that at about 11:45 on that day, I was in this court and saw the prisoner Thompson in the court. I went around with the Senior Constable Marquini to the end of the door, and just as we returned to the corner of the court, the prisoner bolted out of the door, ran along Circular Quay up to Macquarie Place and into a lane where I lost sight of him for some time, but afterwards, in company with the Water Police Senior Constable Hegarty, arrested him in the backyard of Macquarie Place. I took him to the Water Police station, had him placed with 4 more persons. A man named Brennan was then brought in and at once identified the prisoner and placed his hand upon him. I then charged him with burglary, to which he made no reply. I searched him and found 5 shillings and 10.5 pence, a knife and a small key. I told him there were 2 men already in custody for the burglary and that he was charged with being concerned in it. James Brennan deposed, I know the prisoner by sight. The first time I saw him was on Thursday week at 11 o'clock in the day. He was at the back of the 2 hills at Moore Park when the 2 men on the other side of the scrub were sitting on a bank. The prisoner and the other men sat down for a while and I saw them make a hole in the sand. I swear the prisoner was one of the men. I have seen him since at the Bluebell public house. I mentioned the fact to a constable, but when I returned to the public house, the prisoner was gone. And also says that Thomas Baxter alias Smith and William Smith alias Marshall were charged with the same offence and remanded. A week later, it says that John Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, was brought before the court on remand, charged with having shot at and with the intent to murder James Brennan on the 12th. The following is the remainder of the evidence. Constable Charles Ryan stated that he was at Moore Park on the night in question, looking for 3 men who had entered the house of William Gillespie and stolen goods. While watching, the witness saw the 3 men come onto the park, but they, upon seeing him and those who were with him, ran away. The witness called upon them to stand or he would shoot, and as they continued to run, the witness fired a shot over the head of one of them. One of the prisoners, whom he believed to be Thompson, turned around and fired a shot, and they then ran on. The witness fired a shot over the head of Baxter, one of the runaways, for the purpose of intimidating him. About a minute afterwards, the shot was returned by someone. This was the case for the prosecution, and for the defence, Thompson called Crawford, one of the witnesses for the Crown, for the purpose of trying to prove that when the occurrence took place, the moon was obscured by clouds and it would be very difficult to distinguish the features of a man a few yards off as to recognise him again. The prisoner was then committed to take his trial at the next sittings at the Criminal Court at Darlinghurst. So on the 23rd and the 31st of December, John Thompson appeared at the Water Police Court and he was committed for trial. And on the 4th of January 1873 in the Sydney Mail, this was reported. Thomas Baxter alias Smith, William Smith alias Marshall and John Thompson alias Thunderbolt were charged with having burglariously entered the house of William Gillespie. It appeared from the evidence for the prosecution that Gillespie, who is the landlord of the Captain Cook Hotel near Moore Park, purchased the articles on the day in question and at about 11 o'clock in the evening securely fastened all the doors and windows of the house, leaving the goods in the dining room. When the servant girl came down at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, she found the side door open and a dishcloth on the floor stained with mud, as though someone had trodden upon it. The coats and other goods were missed shortly afterwards. Detective Larkins deposed to the arrest of the prisoners and to having received from prisoner Thompson's brother a portmanteau containing clothing, a revolver and 5 cartridges. James Brennan said that after the incident that he went across and reported the matter and returned with assistance and dug up articles from the hole that he noticed men were digging. They then put surveillance in and he saw the prisoners returning to the spot and watched them. After Thompson tried to run away, they ran after him and got within 3 or 4 yards of him. When Thompson turned around and fired at them, the witness then caught his foot in a bush and fell, but his mate took his place and followed the prisoner for 300 or 400 yards when the prisoner also fired at him. This witness was cross-examined by Thompson at great length. Being asked if he had anything to say why the sentence of the court should not be passed on him, Thompson made another speech, alluding in a self-complacent style to the way in which he had defended himself before the court that day, and he considered he had clearly established his innocence. Before passing sentence, His Honour read over a list of previous convictions against each of the prisoners. The 3 of them are young men apparently between 21 and 24 years of age. And it said that Thompson, whose history has been well known to the police for many years, was convicted some considerable time ago upon 2 charges of robbery under arms, of which he received a sentence of 15 years concurrently. He did not, however, remain in the jail until the expiration of his sentence. In this particular case, for which he was also convicted yesterday, he was also armed. And it stated that Thompson received 10 years imprisonment with hard labour upon the roads or other public works of the colony. And a small article outlining his conviction on the 8th of March 1873 says, Conviction of Thunderbolt. A short time since we gave a short account of the capture of John Thompson alias Thunderbolt on charges of burglary and of shooting 2 men near Moore Park with intent to kill. He was tried at Darlinghurst this week and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment with hard labour. He was sentenced on the 27th of June 1865 in 2 cases of robbery under arms to 30 years imprisonment with hard labour, but got off with 7. If the same ratio of remission of punishment is adopted under his present conviction, we may expect him back in the bosom of society in about 2 years hence, when he will probably recommence his little game. And another article on the 8th of March 1873 says, Concurrent sentences. The case of John Thompson alias Thunderbolt, a dangerous criminal convicted at the Central Criminal Court last week, furnishes evidence of the unsatisfactory operation of the system of concurrent sentences. This notorious, athletic and daring young ruffian was convicted at the court at Tamworth on the 27th of June 1865 in 2 distinct cases of robbery with firearms and sentenced to 15 years for each offence, which in ordinary English would import that he had 30 years on the roads. But the sentence was made concurrent, that is, they were to begin and end on the same days. Thus then, instead of 30 years, he got off with only 15. This by good conduct dodge and by the persistent energy of criminal and philanthropic sympathy, as expressed in petitions to the executive, he worked it down to 7 years, and John Thompson alias Thunderbolt was let loose, again to prey on society, on the 3rd of last July. He planned and committed a burglary with 2 worthy associates, and when nearly taken by the police, fired twice on them with his revolver. Fortunately, his prison life has not improved him as a marksman, and he missed. He has now received a 10-year sentence for burglary. Judging from his past history, it probably means no more than 5 years. So he was forwarded to the Berrima Jail, and then he was later transferred to Parramatta Jail, and he was released in February 1881. On the 24th of May 1881, in the Glen Innes Examiner, it discusses bushrangers in Queensland. And it says, young Thunderbolt to the fore. A number of extremely suspicious circumstances have already transpired of late in this portion of the colony, and surmises have arisen that a gang of bushrangers is actually being organised in the backcountry between Aramac and Bowen. Apprehensions have both been felt and expressed that Cobb's Coach and the public houses on the Emerald Road are destined to be stuck up at no very distant date. Suspicion was first excited by the disappearance of a horse at the property of Mr. Springer at the Speculation Hotel. This animal was running at Lake Dunn, a station belonging to Mr. Briggs. A saddle and bridle of Mr. Springer's was also missing. In searching for Mr. Springer's horse, it was found that a large number of Lake Dunn station horses were away. The run has been most carefully examined in order to find tracks, however none can be discovered. It is therefore supposed that the horse was run away just before the late rains and planted at a convenient spot in the desert. Then the stockmen at Lake Dunn are reported to have seen some armed horsemen in the bush. The men are total strangers to them, and they knew nothing that could account satisfactorily for their presence. A young fellow of around 28 or so, conjectured to be the young Thunderbolt, has given rise to considerable apprehension to the publicans on the Emerald Road. He rides a horse which is described as a truly magnificent animal, and is remarked that the animal has recently been rebranded. The man is armed, wearing a revolver inside his shirt. His conversation is not reassuring. He has been offering to purchase arms and ammunition at a good figure, and has been very inquisitive about Cobb's Coach. He wishes to know how many passengers it usually carries and the time of its arrival at particular places. It really does seem probable that a gang of desperadoes have possessed themselves of the Lake Dunn horses with the view of endeavouring to travel them up north for sale. The police are on the alert and will do all in their power for the protection of life and property. On the 16th of August 1882, it's reported that James Jameson, alias Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, with two others, attempted to rob the Australian Mutual Providence Society on the corner of George and Campbell Streets in Sydney. A week later, he appeared in the Central Police Court and was committed for trial. On the 22nd of August 1882, in an article recording this, it says a clever capture. A clever capture of a burglar was made on Wednesday night under somewhat exciting circumstances. A man named James Jameson, alias Thunderbolt, was brought before the Central Police Court today by Constable Chapman, who shortly before midnight saw him and two other men making off with all speed from the premises of the Mutual Providence Savings Bank. The prisoner, Jameson, carried a carpet bag. Chapman intercepted him and made inquiries as to the bag and to what he and his mates were about. No verbal reply was given, but quick as lightning a revolver was drawn from the bag, and the two other men rushing forward attempted to overpower the constable and effect the release of Jameson. They succeeded in throwing the constable to the ground, and Jameson fired at him. Fortunately, either through trepidation or want of skill, he missed his mark and the three men ran off together. Chapman, however, followed Jameson, who, when near Park Street, stopped and turned upon his pursuer and said, "If you don't stop, I will shoot you," at the same time presenting the revolver. Chapman rushed forward and seized the ruffian by the wrist, held him for some time so that he could not make use of his weapon. Jameson, however, succeeded in getting his hands free, fired either twice or three times at the policeman and made off. Neither of the shots, however, took effect. The prisoner then took to his heels and the constable raised an alarm and went in full pursuit until at length Jameson again turned and fired a fifth shot at the officer. At this time a considerable commotion had been caused and police assistance came up. After quite an exciting chase, Jameson was overtaken and apprehended, but he was not secured without a great difficulty, as he fought like a tiger at bay. The prisoner appeared to be very ill when in court, and in the opinion of Dr. Egan, was not in a fit state to be put upon his defence. The police, however, thought that this was not genuine, for there was apparently nothing which could account for his exceeding weakness. He was allowed a chair in the dock while Constable Chapman gave his evidence. An examination of the carpet bag at the station house showed that it contained a choice collection of housebreaking implements. The prisoner was remanded for a week on two charges of having been found at night with housebreaking implements in his possession with the intent to commit a felony, and with shooting at Constable Chapman with intent to do grievous bodily harm. On the 27th of October 1882, it gave an account of Thompson's earlier career as a bushranger. says a career of a boy bushranger. Somewhere about 20 years ago, the settlers in that part of New South Wales, which lies to the north and west of the Dividing Range, were kept in constant dread by one or other of gangs of bushrangers. It was around this period that a boy was known as Young Thunderbolt, and he began his bushranging exploits. And by the intrepid boldness and keen intelligence which he even then so early displayed, it was predicted for him that he would pursue a long career in crime. The son of a civic official in Sydney, a gentleman fairly well-to-do and of excellent repute amongst his fellows, he received the benefit of a moderately good education and would probably have been able to hold his own in the race of men. But as early as 13 or 14 years of age, he began to manifest those criminal instincts which he subsequently so strongly developed. Pilfering whatever he desired from shops and shop doors, he soon began to be known to the police, and he was clever in avoiding detection. For a year or two he escaped conviction, and so he became emboldened by this immunity from punishment. Before he was 16 he was concerned in more than one daring robbery in Sydney, and at last that city became too hot for him and he took to the bush. His first step was to appropriate a horse from one of the paddocks, and then a saddle and bridle from a neighbouring stable, and started further into the interior. He commenced by robbing stores and grog shanties. Though born and bred in the city, he quickly acquired a knowledge of the entire country and an acquaintance with all the methods by which people live and travel in the Australian bush. Amongst other qualities, he became a splendid judge of a horse, and soon bestrode one of the fleetest and most enduring animals to be found anywhere, and so shifting rapidly over hundreds of miles of country, he defied all the efforts that were made to capture him. He made journeys in Goulburn, in the Murrumbidgee, and close to the Queensland border. In a very short time, there were heavy rewards offered for his apprehension, and his description was published in every township in the colony. He appeared then to have fully realised his danger by being without arms. There were horse races being held at small settlements in the bush, and these races young Thunderbolt went disguised as a jockey and even entered his horse for one of the contests. While all in the township were enjoying the sports of the day, he quietly slipped off to the police station, which he quickly entered and secured all the spare revolvers and ammunition he could find, together with a police rifle, all of which he carried to the side of the river close by and planted in thick scrub. Returning unperceived to the racecourse, he again joined in the amusements that were going on, and was the merriest of the merry at a ball or a dance given at the township hotel in the evening. The robbery at the station soon became known, and at the next morning at daybreak the troopers mounted their horses and set off in pursuit of the robbers. Young Thunderbolt, as soon as they were gone, secured his plunder and made straight through the bush in the direction exactly opposite to what the troopers had taken. He then entered a course of being an armed highwayman, and this is where he met with Thunderbolt's gang. Stations, farms and stores were bailed up in all directions, the mail coaches were robbed with alarming frequency, and the gang had several brushes with the troopers, but always succeeded at getting away safely. On one occasion, young Thunderbolt was left with 19 men in a room, while his mates were some distance off, and with a revolver in each hand, he stood at the door in complete subjection until his companions secured the booty. At this time, young Thunderbolt was only 16 years old. Before he reached his 17th year, he became a prisoner at Berrima Jail. There was something a shade romantic in his capture. He'd fallen in love with a girl in one of the townships, and while things were a little quiet, he persuaded 3 of his confederates to accompany him to the hotel where the girl's father lived. Whether there had been treachery or not was never known, but all events the police surprised them, and they had just time to mount their horses and attempt an escape. Young Thunderbolt's horse came down the first fence, and then it was that bushrangers halted and returned the fire of the police. Young Thunderbolt was wounded. His arm was broken, and lying on the ground and unable to get up, he fired away at the troopers, who fired in return at him, and finally left him for dead on the ground. 3 times his associates rode back and attacked the police in their endeavours to carry him off, but they had to fight against fearful odds. The troopers far outnumbered their party, and they were finally compelled to fly. Young Thunderbolt was found alive, taken back to the hotel where he lay for some weeks between life and death. When he did recover, he was taken to Maitland for trial and succeeded, handcuffed as he was, in getting away from his captors, but he was too weak to run far and was soon in custody again, and in a few weeks more he was convicted of a number of charges, receiving a sentence of 18 years that was first served at Berrima, then at Parramatta, and lastly at Darlinghurst. In the earlier part of his prison life, he was a source of great anxiety to the prison authorities, hatching and attempting plots of every description. Seeing, however, that he had an ability far from the common, he was encouraged to exert them in a useful direction. So before he was 18, he learnt 4 trades and became an excellent scholar. He picked up mathematics with surprising quickness and became proficient in history, Latin, and physical geography, and studied several sciences. Indeed, his range of studies were exceedingly wide, and he became at the same time the most useful man in jail. There was no work almost about the prison that he could not do. He then came to the termination of his sentence. A number of gentlemen, knowing his relatives and hearing of his talents, interested themselves on his behalf, and when it was time for his release, he left prison with 3 new suits of clothes, 2 kits of costly tools, and £25 in his pocket. He evinced a quiet determination when he got free to live an honest life and atone for the past, and from the governor of the jail downwards, there was not an official who did not fully believe in the sincerity of his profession. He found friends in abundance, and his services were continually in request for the fine class of carpentering in particular. But alas, for this apparently certain case of criminal reformation, the tendency to crime seemed to have only lain dormant and not been entirely expelled, for once more young Thunderbolt was in Darlinghurst Jail for housebreaking. And he is now at a miserable end. After all, this young bushranger, who was viewed as a sort of Robin Hood or Dick Turpin, is ending up a common housebreaker. Such a career carries a moral of its own. On the 7th of November 1882, he was convicted with the shop robbery that was committed on the 24th of July, and he was sentenced to 10 years hard labour. And then on the same day, he was also tried for shooting Constable Chapman with intent to murder him, but the jury hadn't reached a verdict after 36 hours, and he was acquitted. However, on the 14th of November 1882, he was found guilty of shooting with intent to murder and shooting with an intent to do grievous bodily harm, and he received 10 years hard labour on the roads or other works of the colony to date from the expiration of his other sentence of 10 years for burglary. The article on the 10th of November says Thunderbolt, this notorious criminal, together with 2 others named Owens and Gordon, were tried at the Central Criminal Court for the burglary of Mr. Graham's shop in George Street. The jury, after listening to powerful appeals from the prisoners, who asserted their innocence, found them all not guilty. And then on the 15th of November 1882, an article titled Thunderbolt, this notorious housebreaker and burglar made a desperate attempt to escape from custody yesterday afternoon while being conveyed into the jail after receiving a sentence of 20 years hard labour from Mr. Justice Windermere. So he received 10 years hard labour on the roads for shooting with intent to murder, and then another 10 years for burglary. While being removed from the court by Sergeants Peary and Keating, he made a sudden plunge and a rush towards the door, but the officers were prepared and immediately seized him and conveyed him safely within the walls of the jail. His attempt to escape caused much excitement. On the 28th of April 1894, it was announced that an old criminal was released. A few days ago, James Jameson, alias Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, served only 12 years of the sentence, amounting to 20 that was passed in 1882. Having, in addition to his good conduct, remissions, had a special remission for services in connection with putting out a fire in the jail hospital. Jameson, though only of middle age, has passed in all 30 years in jail. His 1882 sentence was for burglary and shooting with intent to avoid apprehension. He is now leaving the colony for good. And an article in the Sydney Evening News on the 28th of April 1894 gives a little more insight into the criminal life of John Thompson. It's titled, A Notorious Criminal Has Spent Nearly 30 Years in Jail. A few days ago, the authorities granted the release from prison of James Jameson, alias Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, a determined criminal who, as already reported, though only 43 years of age, has spent nearly 30 years of his life in jail. Jameson, a native of England, commenced his downward career very early in life, for in 1865, we find, he received 15 years on the roads for robbery under arms. At this time, highway robbery for youths was very frequent, and Jameson, despite his tender years, was the head of a gang of young desperadoes whose exploits for a time caused a considerable sensation. Although utterly reckless and desperate when at large, Jamieson appears during the whole of his long jail career to have been an exemplary prisoner, and in 1873 we find him released from custody on a good conduct certificate and again incarcerated a few weeks later after his release for burglary. On the 16th of August 1882, he was concerned with 4 other men in an attempt to rob the Mutual Providence Savings Bank in Haymarket, and after a long chase and a severe struggle, during which he fired 3 revolver shots at Constable John Chapman, he was arrested and received 2 10-year cumulative sentences. During his incarceration for the last offence, he behaved admirably and showed great bravery in helping extinguish a fire that broke out at the back of the hospital some time back. But for his services, the building would have been burnt down. Thunderbolt received his release on condition that he left Australia for another country, and shortly after leaving Darlinghurst, he was on board a fast-sailing ship bound for fresh lands, where it is to be hoped the remainder of his life will be spent to more advantage than were his earlier years. A picture taken from a portrait immediately from his release shows he is in splendid condition and possesses a fine physique. Another article at the time said that he would probably be going to South Africa. And another article states in a little more detail, the remission of the prisoner's sentence has been made conditionally on Jamieson being under police surveillance from the time of his exit from the jail gates until his departure for the Cape Colony, where it is understood he has signified his willingness to proceed. As a prisoner, Jamieson, during his latter sentence, has been most exemplary in his conduct. A cabinet maker and joiner of more than average ability, his work is brought under the notice of visitors to the jail with pride, and in fact some splendid specimens of the prisoner's handicraft have graced some of our colonial exhibitions. A man with more ordinary intelligence, with a desire for self-culture, Jamieson has by constant study in his spare hours made himself thoroughly conversant with many useful and desirable attainments. For some years he's acted as an organist to the Presbyterian congregation of which he is a member, and has on many occasions during the Christmas and Easter holidays given most entertaining and illustrative lectures on phrenology to his fellow prisoners. Phrenology at the time was considered a science, and it was the study of the conformation of the skull, where you could look at the size of the skull, the shape of the skull, and you were able to indicate mental faculties and traits of a certain person's character. Through kindness, he has succeeded in completely taming an Australian crow, magpie and minnow bird, the former of which speaks fluently to the amusement of visitors to the yard generally, and the latter, although at liberty to go as you please, always returns to its owner at call. Away from old associations and in a new and distant land, there is every possibility that Jamieson, alias Thompson, alias Thunderbolt, will, with his good natural energies and abilities directed to a legitimate purpose, succeed, if not in obliterating the past, in inaugurating in the future a life of honesty and freedom. And 14 years later, on the 23rd of May 1906, in the Australian Star, it says, "In memory of Thunderbolt, a work of art in the prisons department, Thompson, Thunderbolt's boy. The memory of Thunderbolt the outlaw is fittingly perpetuated in the prisons department in Sydney's New Scotland Yard. In the room of the Deputy Controller of Prisons is a handsome inlaid wooden mantelpiece, the work of Jack Thompson, who's better known as Thunderbolt's boy, and who accompanied the notorious bushranger during a portion of his career. While Thompson was working out his destiny in Darlinghurst, he made this mantelpiece, which is probably one of the finest pieces of work of its kind in Sydney. It was with considerable pride that Mr. Macaulay, Deputy Controller, patted Thunderbolt's chimney piece and repeated its history. He said he was one of the cleverest carpenters and greatest hypocrites I ever knew. He could send the tears rolling down the cheeks and have you blubbering in sympathy, and all the time he'd be looking for an opening to do some mischief." And then on the 25th of September 1921 in The Sun, Thunderbolt II, Stories of Old Darlinghurst, Fight with Madmen, Grim Struggle on Slippery Roof. At one time there was numbered amongst the guests at the old jail a prisoner that called himself Thunderbolt. His name appeared on the records as John Thompson. The original Thunderbolt was never in Darlinghurst jail, but this other Thunderbolt was just as remarkable a character in his way. He came under the notice of authorities in connection with the shooting of a constable. His sentence was 20 years, which was afterwards considerably reduced. and Thunderbolt II was finally set free and is believed to have gone to Africa. There are jail officials at the present moment who will give you a very good insight into the manner of the man that this Thunderbolt II actually was. He was about the least trouble of all in his time, they will say. Once there was a serious outbreak of fire there. Convicts were in a panic at the prospect of being trapped in their locked cells. Warders ran hither and thither searching for water. In those days, facilities were not as they are now, and the flames spread so rapidly that it was feared that the floors of all the cells would have to be opened to prevent the unfortunate occupants from meeting a ghastly death. There would have been dozens of escapes in the confusion. Just when the fire seemed to have gained an absolute ascendancy, Thunderbolt pleaded to be allowed to give a hand. They let him do so, and in a comparatively few minutes the flames were under control. Thunderbolt, through his experience in the wilds, knew the work of sand in killing flames. There was a pile of sand in the yard, and while warders and others were scurrying about in search of water, they disregarded the obvious weapon lying at their hand. But Thunderbolt knew, and he probably saved the prison. This was not the only time that he distinguished himself at Darlinghurst. On occasions when there were all sorts of criminals incarcerated behind its walls, some of the most revolting type, one such was a huge, brawny, black-browed man of simian depth of chest and length of arm. He was the surliest man in the jail. His temper was more like a wild animal than a man. Warders were frightened of him, and on a few occasions when they had to enter his cell, they kept a wary eye of his actions. The task of handing him his food was considered dangerous. For weeks this man hardly spoke to a soul. He crouched in the darkest recess of his cell when locked up and peered angrily at every warder going on his rounds who looked in on him. And a glance at his history was scarcely reassuring, for he was marked as a homicidal maniac. He kept entirely to himself, and what dark plot he was hatching no one knew. An uneasy feeling came over everyone when near him, and it seemed to be something more than actual physical fear. One evening towards dusk, when several prisoners were still in the yard, a yell went up and a warder was seen staggering back against a wall. A second later, a wild figure burst through the startled prisoners, scattering them right and left with flailing blows from his gigantic arms, and with almost superhuman agility he commenced to climb up a piece of running pipe from the roof of the building to the ground. The piping was very close to the wall, and there was scarcely room for a finger grip, much less an arm or leg work, but up he went with extraordinary skill. He reached the top, and with a howl of triumph seized a heavy piece of iron which formed part of the roof. Tearing it from his bed, he lifted it high above his head and flung it with all his strength into the crowd of men below. They scattered and fell harmlessly into the courtyard. As it crashed down, another man dashed from the crowd, and with much agility, almost as had been shown by the madman climbing up the piping, fingers and knees were his only means of progress, but he made a rapid way and presently was on the roof, facing the criminal. It was Thunderbolt. As he clambered onto the roof, the madman saw him, and with the howl of the wild beast, rushed straight at him in an endeavour to hurl him bodily to the ground. This Thunderbolt II was no weed. His antagonist was a veritable giant, and locked in savage embrace, they swayed to and fro on that slippery roof, while their fellows, warders and prisoners alike, down below watched breathlessly. It looked as though it would be certain death for one, if not for both, but they were now powerless to protect Thunderbolt, since to fire at the madman meant it was likely not shooting the wrong man. So they watched and waited while the grim struggle swayed, now one way and now another. Gradually it became apparent that Thunderbolt was getting the upper hand. The wild and Herculean onslaughts of the madman grew feebler and less frequent. The great muscles of his chest heaved with the strain of his efforts, until it seemed as if they would burst. Thunderbolt hung on in bulldog style, and finally had his man prostrate before him, securely held, and unable to damage his captor even by the savage kicks, which were all he was able to aim at him now. The speedy arrival of a ladder and warders with handcuffs did the rest. Thunderbolt went back to his cell as though it was all in a day's hard labour. And it seems that John Massey Thompson disappeared at this point, and you may have noticed that in the article it mentioned that he went to Africa. So once he had done that stint in jail, it seems that he had left Australia. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, he was one of 16 children. Family trees have information on 10 of his siblings. So the assumption is that the remainder of the siblings quite possibly were stillborn or died in infancy. So just a little more about his father, William. In May 1861, his father became insolvent, and his father died only 5 years later in June 1866 in Redfern at the age of 51. His occupation at the time of his death was a corporation officer. Their youngest child was only an infant at the time of his death. And his death notice states, on the 23rd of June at 10 p.m, after a long and painful illness in which he bore a Christian fortitude, Mr. William Thompson of County Cork Island, late officer of the City Corporation Sydney, at his residence, Yarnold Street, Redfern, of decline. The deceased has held a government appointment in different parts of the world for 32 years. He leaves a wife and family of 7 to deplore his loss. And his mother Eliza died only 4 years later, also at the age of 53, in February 1870, with their youngest child only being 4. So it says on the 16th of February at her residence, number 46 Denham Street, off Campbell Street, Surrey Hills, after a short but painful illness, Mrs. Eliza Massey Thompson, relict of the late Mr. William Thompson, late Inspector of the City Corporation. John's siblings. Benjamin was the eldest, and he was born in 1842 in Ireland. He was 10 when they emigrated. On the 5th of April 1859, Benjamin Thompson, who was sent to the Mudgee diggings by the Committee of Sydney on the 30th of October 1856. Immediately after returning from the Port Curtis goldfields by the ship Isks. Should any person know anything about this lad, whether living or dead, his parents will feel most thankful and pay any expense attending the information sought for. Mrs. William Thompson, Post Office, Sydney. He married Catherine McConnell in Cowra in 1871. Benjamin died on the 16th of June 1921 in Newtown, New South Wales, at the age of 79, and his death certificate states that he was late of Marindi via Mudgee, and he died of epithelioma of the tongue, and it mentions on his death certificate that he was married in Sydney, but there's no specific details of the name of his wife. It stated his occupation was a gold miner, and there were no children listed. The next child was William Massey Thompson, born in 1846 in Waterford, Ireland. He was a twin, and he married Emma Frances Tyrrell in Sydney in 1878 when he was 32. He was the informant on his father's death certificate, and William died in 1917 in Balmain South, aged 71. There doesn't seem to be children from this marriage. And his twin brother, George Massey Thompson, he married a lady named Helen, and he was a cook, and he lived at Gadooga, New South Wales, and he was aged only 47 when he died on the 24th of September 1893 at Brenda Station, and his cause of death was suicide by drowning, and he also had no children. The fourth child was Henry Massey Thompson, and he was born in December 1849 at Gilston, Hertfordshire, England. He resided in George Street, Waterloo in 1873, and he must have had some connection with John at this time because he stated evidence that actually worked against John in the Moore Park case, saying that he was the receiver of a portmanteau that in fact John had stolen. And he died at Bathurst, New South Wales on the 1st of April 1908 at the age of 58. And his death was recorded in the paper. It says, sudden death at Bathurst. On Wednesday morning, the Western Mail train arrived at Bathurst at 3:15 with a man named Henry Thompson who was visiting the Bathurst show. He was found to be seriously ill and in a state of collapse. He was taken charge of by the police and conveyed to a doctor who stated that the man was dying and ordered him to the hospital. On the way there, he died. An inquiry was held before the coroner. When it was found the deceased had died from inflammation of the bowels, it was ascertained that the man had relations in Darlinghurst and was 58 years of age. And he didn't marry or have children. The next child was Eliza, and she was born in 1852 in Cambridgeshire, England. Some family trees state that she died before 1866, although there isn't a death record to substantiate that information. She was 2 months old when they emigrated to Australia. Sophia Amelia Massey Thompson was born in Sydney in September 1854. She married Patrick Waters Carter on the 27th of August 1869 when she was 14 and Patrick 24. Patrick was a storekeeper who seemed to do quite well for himself. He had a drapery section in his store, and it seems that their residence was attached to the store. Patrick and Sophia had 11 children, and then Sophia went to live at Newcastle. So in 1936, she was living at Newcastle. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, and Sophia died there in September 1941 at the age of 87. Hugh Massey Thompson was the next child, who was born on the 8th of December 1856 in George Street, Redfern. He married Frances Emma Capes in 1891 in Sydney when he was 35 and Emma 25. Hugh was a clerk at the time of their marriage. They had 2 children, one surviving infancy, a son. Frances died in Annandale, New South Wales in 1896, and Hugh went on to marry in 1898 in Sydney to Emily Winifred Clark, who was 12 years younger than him. They had 6 children together. In 1937, Hugh was living in Leichhardt, New South Wales, and working as a theatrical attendant. And Hugh died on the 23rd of January 1938 at his residence, 74 Marlborough Street, Leichhardt, at the age of 81. The next child, Eliza, was also known as Lily, and she was born in 1860. She married John George Oram on the 2nd of June 1885 in Paddington. John's father was an inspector of public vehicles in Sydney. They had 2 sons together, and Eliza died in Randwick in January 1929 at the age of 69. Alice M.D. Thompson was born in 1864 in Sydney, and there are no further records for her, so the assumption is that she died either stillborn or quite young. And the 10th child recorded in family trees is Edward Walcott Thompson. He was born in 1866 in Sydney. He died on the 30th of May 1937 at his residence in Wilnelstead, 87 Wellington Street, Newtown. His wife was Winnie, and they had the following children, Elsie, Victor and Maggie. And Edward died at the age of 70. In one of John Thompson's online stories, it does say that in the mid-1860s, a brother worked for the Sydney Morning Herald. So the assumption is based on the dates that it was either George or it was William. So based on his family, it really does seem that John Massey Thompson was the black sheep of the family. He certainly went on a very different path to all of his siblings and his parents. And unfortunately, with some areas of family history, you just can't solve the mysteries that are there. And I would have loved to have said that I had been able to find John Massey Thompson somewhere in South Africa with reports to give you an idea of how he fared for himself for the rest of his life. But unfortunately, at this point, that is a needle in a haystack. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed the episode based on John Massey Thompson, the young Thunderbolt, and his family.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.